Hi folks, here we go into a discussion of the integumentary system. As we get into this system, in this video, we'll look at some of the following areas. What structures make up the integumentary system? What does this system even do? What are the major regions of the skin? What are some of the layers, or what are the layers of the epidermis? What cells are associated with the epidermis? Where does skin color come from, and why are there differences in skin pigmentation? And what are some of the pathologies that we associate with skin pigmentation? So first, let's look at this one question. The integumentary system consists of A, B, C, or D, and it might surprise you to learn that actually is B. We don't consider just the skin in the integumentary system. It is probably the most obvious component of it, but also hair, nails, and certain glands are also included in the system. We can see a reference to some terms that refer to the difference between the skin and the rest of the system. You may see a term cutaneous membrane that refers to just the skin, but I wanted to make sure you understood that this system does include more than just the skin. Okay, so what are the functions of the skin? We'll start there. We'll start with the cutaneous membrane. Let me go ahead and give you that term. So that's what we're talking about here. So what are the functions of the cutaneous membrane? Some of these are probably pretty obvious to us. When we think about protection, we recognize that the skin protects us from chemicals, from microorganisms, from even the sun to some degree, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. It also excretes. It does allow us to get rid of certain salts, get rid of water as part of a cleansing process. It also, of course, when we excrete, it helps us for the third one, which is to maintain body temperature. As we get too hot, we can direct blood flow toward our skin. It will help stimulate sweat glands, and by the water leaving our skin, it carries away with it heat and does help cool us. The production of melanin. This actually is responsible for most of our skin pigmentation, and pigmentation, as we'll see, has a real important role in protecting us from too much UV radiation. Production of keratin, this is another protein that actually helps semi-waterproof our skin so we don't lose too much water from our skin. The synthesis of vitamin D3. This is actually important for the metabolism of calcium, and we will touch on this more a little bit later. We also do store lipids with the skin, particularly in the subcutaneous layer, which we'll see in just a second, and in sensory detection. Obviously, we can determine or detect heat, cold, pressure, and pain through our skin, so that's also an important function of the skin. Okay, let's look at the skin in overview, and then we're going to zoom in and get to certain parts of this. The skin overview, so just a section of the skin taken out here. Recognize there are two major layers of the skin. There is the epidermis and the dermis. And again, this all still refers to the cutaneous membrane. And we'll get into what's in each of these regions in a second, but these represent the cutaneous membrane proper. There's also this layer down here you don't see labeled on our diagram that I went ahead and labeled the hypodermis. You also see it called the superficial fascia. You also see it called the subcutaneous membrane. It's not really part of the skin itself, but it represents a boundary. It does help store, and you see it here sort of lumpy yellow showing the storage of fat. It helps bind our skin to the deeper layers. So the deep fascia, the deeper layers that are going to be around muscles, this helps bind our skin to those deeper layers, the subcutaneous membrane. So we'll kind of touch on it a little bit later, but I want to mention it here. So before we delve in, recognize that when we're talking about these layers, the epidermis has 4 or 5 subparts or sublayers that make up this very thin piece of the skin. The dermis has 2 regions or zones, and we will approach that on another video. But you will notice that the dermis is actually deeper, or thicker rather, than the epidermis, and we'll talk about the glands and the blood vessels and the hair associated with the dermis a little bit later. But for now, let's go ahead and focus on the epidermis. So if we take this little section here, and we're going to zoom in on it, if we do, we will get that. And I'm going to get myself out of the way here for a second. We'll talk about these layers in a moment. Wherever you see strata, strata means layer. We'll talk about the layers here in just a moment. But first, let's talk about the major cells that we find in the epidermis itself. And I just want to go through and give you some highlights on each of these so that you're clear on what they are doing, why they're there. Okay, the first term we'll look at are the keratinocytes. This right here, this represents about 90% of all of the cells of the epidermis. So the majority of what you're seeing here, all the cells up here, and really everything but the black ones, the red ones, and the yellow ones, all of those represent keratinocytes. Keratinocytes are cells, the site part means cell, that help make keratin. Keratin is a tough protein that helps protect the skin. It also makes some what are called lamellar granules, which also provide a waterproofing property to the skin. So the majority of the epidermis are keratinocytes. About 8%, and the numbers really aren't critical for us, but I'll give it to you anyway here, just so you recognize it. 8% of the cells are represented by these, the melanocytes. The melanocytes, these black branching cells, are going to produce melanin. In this case, we're talking about a brown-black pigment that contributes to skin color, hair color, and it does help protect us against UV radiation, and we'll look at that more in a moment. The red cells indicated here are Langerhans cells. Langerhans cells are actually cells that come from the bone marrow, and they will migrate to the skin. These are going to be important because they help defend us against microbes. Microbes that could get into these first layers of the skin. These Langerhans cells are already there, and if a microbe were to get to them, they could actually help phagocytize it. You may also see these called epidermal dendritic cells, but Langerhans cells and epidermal dendritic cells are the same thing. And Merkel cells. Merkel cells here are the yellow cells, and let me show you something about this. Notice how this Merkel cell has this branch that comes down here, and if you look carefully at its label, it says this is a sensory neuron. So a Merkel cell is actually a sensory cell. It helps, it aids in sensation. So in areas where we don't have hair on our skin, we tend to have more Merkel cells, and Merkel cells help us detect some basic sensations in that part of the epidermis. But as I mentioned, these cells are organized into layers. And again, the majority of the cells we're talking about are keratinocytes. But let's just highlight the layers we're going to about to see here. The stratum basale is the most basic layer. And if I were to highlight and kind of follow along here, the stratum basale is going to be these layers of cells that wrap around here, and we go all the way around. It's a single layer of cells that goes all the way around here. Now, you also will find the stratum spinosum, which is the next layer going deep to superficial, and we'll see a better slide of this in just a moment. The next layer above that, superficial to that, is the stratum granulosum. In thick skin that we associate with things like the bottoms of your feet, you would find the stratum lucidum, this quote-unquote extra layer of cells, and then you'd have the stratum corneum as the most superficial layer. When you put one hand on top of the other and you're feeling your skin, you're feeling stratum corneum. So as we move to the next slide, let's zoom in on these layers individually, and we can see them a little bit better here. Okay, as we look at each of these layers, let's take one at a time and talk about the major characteristics or why that layer is doing what it's doing. The stratum basale, let's start at the bottom. The stratum basale is going to, again, be a single row of columnar or cuboidal cells that are going to be at the border or the base between the epidermis and the dermis. So down here, begins the dermis. And so we're not talking about that. We're talking about instead these layers of cells that are going to be along through here. Okay, this layer makes up the stratum basale. Now notice we are going to have some other cells embedded in there, so you do recognize melanocytes are here. We do have a Merkel cell here, but we're talking about really these other cells, the keratinocytes that are making up this layer. Now, it might be a little hard to see, but they're showing you, in this one in particular, they're showing you a cell undergoing cell division. They're trying to show you that this cell layer is actively mitotic. You have among the cells that make up the stratum basale some stem cells, and we've talked about stem cells briefly in the past, but stem cells are cells that the body uses to generate other cells. So the stem cells of the stratum basale are going to be producing more stem cells like themselves, and also cells that are going to be new keratinocytes. As these new keratinocytes are formed, they're going to be pushed superficially. They're going to be pushed up as new cells are replaced behind them. So the more active the stratum basale layer is, the more cells are being produced, and the cells are going to be pushed here from deep to superficial. The next layer of cells we see here is a stratum spinosum, and this is going to be about 8 to 10 layers of keratinocytes. These are going to be, again, plump, happy cells, very active. They're producing some keratin. They are, again, they look to me as very healthy cells, but it's called spinosum because there appear to be these tiny sort of pin-like connections between them, and it gives it sort of this appearance of spininess. These cells are, again, in the midst of making keratin, so they're making some waterproofing. As the cells continue to be pushed superficially, we get to the stratum granulosum layer. These cells don't look as happy. These cells are all compressed, they're dehydrated, they're flattened out, and why it's called a granulosum layer is it looks like there's little pebbles inside there on this layer. The granulosum layers, those granules rather, are lamellar granules, and those again are going to be important for some waterproofing, important for some dehydration. These cells are beginning to die. So what we really want is the keratin. We want that waterproofing protein. The cells now are somewhat less important than the keratin. Again, if we did have thick skin, we would have what layer next would appear here? The stratum lucidum, but they're showing us a thin section here as you have over most of the body. So the stratum corneum will be the next layer. The stratum corneum is going to be about 25 to 30 layers of dead, flattened cells. The keratinocytes are very obvious, and obviously they're scaled like they're a stratum corneum. We're going to have squamous cells here. They are still going to be somewhat attached to each other, but again, as we said before, the stratum corneum being a stratified squamous epithelium gives us some protection. It takes about 7 to 10 days for a cell to start here to be pushed all the way up to the stratum corneum layer, and another 2 weeks or so before before that cell will reach the very superficial surface and will be shed. It's important to note that the stratum corneum, this is a water resistant layer, but not waterproof. As fluid is lost as interstitial fluid migrates its way to the surface up through these cells, some fluid is going to be lost every single day. And the term we use for this is insensible respiration. You are going to be losing some fluid each day. I'm sorry. Insensible perspiration. I got that. I can't fix it. Insensible perspiration. I was thinking about something else. So as we sweat, as we perspire some fluid, it's going to be moving through the stratum corneum layer. Uh, this is important because if someone were to lose their stratum corneum, let's say to a burn injury, they're going to have more fluid potentially leaving the body, excuse me, than than they really need to, and this high fluid loss is one complication to burns. So let's take just a second and talk a little bit more about the melanation process and how we get melanin to the other keratinocytes and its purpose. So once again, the big green cell now it's green, the big green cell down here is a melanocyte, and what you are seeing is the production in the Golgi apparatus and ultimately in the melanocyte itself of these little granules of melanin inside these containers, which are called melanosomes. So the melanosome is the container, the melanin is the protein inside there. And remember, the melanocytes have these long branching protrusions that go around many of these basal epidermal cells. And notice what happens. The epithelial cells in these areas are going to phagocytize the tips. They're going to, and you see number 3 here, they're going to pinch off the some of those melanosomes and therefore get some melanin. And then this is how we end up transferring the melanin to the keratinocytes. Again, keratinocytes don't make melanin on their own, so without the melanocytes transferring the melanin to them, they wouldn't have them. Now, this slide doesn't show it as well as this slide here. Notice where the melanin ends up. All these dots here represent essentially melanin. We can think of them that way. Look where they are in each of these cells. They are superficial to the nuclei. Here's a nucleus, here's one, here's one. The melanocytes have produced the melanin, which has ended up on the north side, if you will, on the superficial side of the nuclei. Why do you think that's so important? The melanin rather, is going to be shielding the DNA from UV radiation. So the melanin is going to help absorb it. And why is it so important to protect the nucleus? The nucleus contains what? The DNA. If the DNA is damaged, that can take us down a road toward cancer. And we'll talk about skin cancer a little bit later. I just want to mention one more time when we think about metabolism and the production of melanin that melanin actually starts from here, from tyrosine, which is an amino acid. And notice we have in multiple places tyrosinase, an enzyme that's important for the catabolizing or the conversion of tyrosine into different intermediates. Why this is important is someone who does not have tyrosinase has one form of albinism, and we'll see that more in just a moment. I do want to point out here that melanin actually has several different kinds. Eumelanin, the one we see down here, is the pigment we're talking about most. We're talking about pigmentation of the skin, the brown-black pigment we associate with melanin itself. Pheomelanin is actually a different kind of melanin that we associate more with like red hair. It gives things sort of a pinkish tint. So in some parts of the bodies, like the nipples, for example, there would be a slightly different color because of the role of phenomelanin. But just want to mention a couple of skin color changes that we associate with melanin production. Albinism, as we mentioned before, is going to be where there is a lack of melanin production. They may be able to produce melanin, except that they lack the enzymes to do it. So people tend to associate this more with African Americans, but any racial group can have this particular mutation and therefore not produce coloration in the eyes or the skin. Albinos tend to be quite light sensitive because they lack the pigments in their eyes, which help absorb light. Albinos have light come into their eyes and sort of scatter around inside their eyeball and give them some kind of some temporary blindness. Vitiligo is another condition that we associate with melanin production. Vitiligo is where you have some some destruction of the melanocytes in patches. So the melanocytes are dying in certain sections of the skin, and the cause of this is unknown. The suspicion for this is that it's possibly autoimmune, possibly it's some form of stress-induced autoimmune disorder, but someone can have sections, whole sections of their skin like this that are continuous that have vitiligo, or they can have blotches, as you see here, where they can have certain sections of it. So again, it's not a disease in and of itself where it's going to be harmful. It's just they're going to have some irregularities in their pigmentation because of the death of melanocytes. And finally, I want to mention one more. We'll talk about some other skin pigmentation things in a moment, in another video rather. But I want to mention again one more, keratin. Keratin is actually a pigment that we associate with carrots and squash and other of these sort of orange vegetables. But someone who consumes too much of it actually can store keratin in their skin, most notably in their deeper dermis, but it can give the skin a yellow or orangish appearance. It's not a bad thing per se. We do need to have keratin in our diet, and we actually metabolize this into a vitamin A form that we do use for vision. That's why you hear that carrots are good for your vision. But as you see there, it actually can tinge or pigment the skin slightly orange because of an accumulation of too much of it. Okay, that's going to do it for this video. Next, we'll get into the dermis.